South Africa's transition to a democratic state in 1994 was accompanied by significant challenges in the management of its public finances. The new administration needed to respond to the enormous social needs of its diverse citizens by adopting a longer-term view of its public finances. The PFM system thus had to undergo a major reform that included the introduction of a medium-term expenditure framework. Andrew Donaldson, former Deputy Director General at the South African National Treasury, talks about his experience during this reform period.
This was a new administration, a political party making the transition from a resistance and movement of social protest and mobilization into government, and in a context where, although there'd been extensive negotiations, this was a negotiated transition rather than an overthrow of a government, there were nonetheless considerable problems of trust and continuity in government. And I was working in a small research unit at the time attached to the Department of Finance and engaged in preliminary work on new policies and priorities, but importantly also changes in the structure of the public finances that would need to be made as part of this transition. So it's important to say this is an example on a large and substantial scale of the problem that all finance ministries and treasuries face everywhere in the world all the time, which is a gap between expectations and the capacity to deliver. But here, expectations that were very large, that were driven by many decades of frustration and in a context of a very unequal society in which public services had for a century and more been organized around the interests of one part of the population and not others. So a considerable backlog of inequality in infrastructure, in services, in inequality between urban and rural areas, and fragmentation of the public finances into separate administrations for separate racial and ethnic groups. So a big problem and challenge of integration of the public finances, shifts in priorities and resources, a redistribution that needed to be achieved. The dynamics of change, persuading people to do things differently, changing the rules of the budget process, those dynamics of course differ from context to context. In South Africa's circumstances in the 1990s, a new administration, many new officials in government committed to change and committed to succeeding with the implementation of the new priorities of government and embracing, if you like, the political commitment which lay behind these administrative reforms, made it an exciting and a challenging and an interesting place to be. It's hard work, but it's immensely rewarding. It's hard work for officials, and if you're going to add new processes and new complexity, more demands to the budget process and to financial management every year, you're going to get some resistance. You're going to get people saying, well, why are we trying to make things more difficult? Why don't we just do it the way we did it last year? And so you've got to think quite hard about how your reforms over time contribute to making the job easier, certainly making it possible to improve the budget process, and a medium-term expenditure framework can do that. If you recognize that reforms take time to be implemented, if you're asking people to do things differently in the budget process, you have to give them more time to do that, and so there has to be a sufficient allocation of time to departments to do their own planning processes. And large departments often rely on spending planning systems that have to be decentralized down to local offices, different divisions of a big department like police or education departments. And those processes take time and involve consultation. And you want to build a culture of engagement with the budget processes that is not just limited to a few finance officials in the head office of a department. You want to build processes that extend through the administrations. And then the budget process needs to provide sufficient time for that. So that's an important lesson. If you're making significant changes, ensure that the plan for the rollout of the reforms gives implementing departments the time that they need to make those reforms. In the early years of my work within the finance ministry, I was in a finance department, which in the 1990s was just part of the Ministry of Finance. There was also a separate Department of State Expenditure, and so the longer-term planning and the fiscal framework and the economic policy work was done within the Finance Department. The detailed expenditure management was done within a Department of State Expenditure. One of the important reforms of the late 1990s was to merge the Departments of State Expenditure and Finance. So that was an important part of the expanding team of officials involved in budgeting that I was part of, and that was a very interesting reform because it involved bringing economists together with people with a public finance management background and budgeting background and an accounting background, and saying, well, actually we need both those perspectives. Often it's not just 2 but 3 or 4 or 5 perspectives. In infrastructure areas it's useful to have an engineer in the room. But 1994 was the change of administration. 1996 was the publication of a macroeconomic framework, the growth, employment and redistribution framework of government, and 1997-98 were the years in which the major reforms in introducing a medium-term expenditure framework, introducing a new structure of allocating resource finance to national government, provinces and municipalities was introduced, our equitable division of revenue, as it's called in our constitution, and completion of the consolidation of the public accounts, dismantling of the old administration and decentralized systems, and consolidation of accounts in new departments and provinces. And indeed in the introduction of our medium-term expenditure framework, the budget reforms, the public finance management reforms that we undertook in the late 1990s, we had the advantage of drawing on some expert advice from other governments, from the international multilateral agencies, from the World Bank and the IMF, from the European Commission. And that international expertise, often providing a sounding board or a source of advice, certainly contributed to bringing in new ideas and allowing the proposals that were under discussion in South Africa to be tested against experience in other countries. And that is about recognizing what capacity you have and how you need to supplement it from capacity elsewhere within your own country, but also possibly internationally. So I think you have to have a degree of modesty about your own capacity, recognition of the limitations of in-house capacity, particularly in the context of the pressures of institutional change in areas like budget reform that extend right across government and will always involve things that are more complex than you recognize initially. The evolution of our medium-term expenditure framework involved a changing tension between the top-down analytical work done largely in the Treasury, collaborative expenditure reviews done in association with researchers and planners in other departments, and what we sometimes call bottom-up budgeting for the medium term, which all departments had to introduce into their budgeting. I think when you're introducing a medium-term expenditure framework, when you're introducing, as we did, formula-based allocations between provinces for functions like education and health, you're introducing new approaches to infrastructure planning and allocation, you have to have a vision of where you're going, but you've also got to recognize that it's not going to work out quite the way you think. And so budget reform is very much about planning ahead, and planning often well ahead. It can take several years for new legislation and new processes to be introduced and phased in. Planning ahead and also adapting those plans over time. And so the medium-term expenditure framework, which we first did as an analytical top-down exercise with a comparatively small team, 10 or 12 officials, working through the numbers in the main functions of government spending, and trying to understand the drivers between change, the demographic changes, urbanization, shifts of population, driving school numbers or demand for health services. An analytical exercise that involved building spreadsheets and models. That's how we first built our longer-term and medium-term expenditure framework. And then we opened it up and integrated it into the budget process, and it became something quite different from that initial top-down, analytical, spreadsheet-based a set of models. We certainly, when we first introduced the idea of a medium-term expenditure framework, had only a fairly vague understanding of where we were headed. 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, the structure of our documentation changed. We had new formats for presenting budgets to Parliament. We'd learnt something about the difference between the kinds of planning you have to do for short-term projects and the kinds of planning and budgeting that you need to do for longer-term major infrastructure projects, which can be 5 or 10-year commitments. So you need different approaches for those. We had to learn as we went along, and I think that that's an important bit of advice for ministries anywhere in the world. There's a tension between your plans and the adaptation of those plans over time to what you learn as you implement them. I was in the National Treasury and have had the privilege of being associated with the Ministry of Finance in South Africa for over 20 years at an extraordinarily exciting and interesting time. This is for a public finance economist. I don't think you could wish for a more interesting and exciting career. There's still lots to do. I'm still see challenges ahead, but being part of a team involved in implementing reforms, having had the privilege of not just conceptualizing change, but actually being given the space over many years to see reforms through to their implementation has been immensely rewarding. It's not been about consensus and agreement on everything. It's often the excitement is about differences of opinion around the table, and the South African Treasury has always been a place that has been recognized that there are no straightforward answers to most public policy questions. There are things that have to be argued through, talked through, decisions taken, and often decisions taken in the absence of complete certainty, but also in the presence of good analysis and good information. The South African Treasury today is larger and much stronger than it was 20 years ago when we began these reforms. There are advantages and disadvantages in that. The reforms that we introduced in the late 1990s in some ways were made easier because the Treasury was comparatively small. It was a fairly small and close-knit team working together to coordinate those reforms. But their implementation has, of course, inevitably involved an expansion of capacity, and so the Treasury as an organization is bigger than it was then and has more capacity, is more able to engage with the details of work. But that makes it more diffuse, and so the coordination challenges in a more diffuse, a larger organization in government that has grown and expanded in many ways, and in its and greater complexity in the relationships between Treasury and municipalities and provinces and state-owned companies, off-budget entities. Those are areas in which there's still a lot of work to do.